Alves James Key Jr. I was born February the 23rd, 1947 in Dallas, Texas.
And your educational background?
I have a master's degree in professional development criminal justice from Dallas Baptist University.
And when did you join the military?
I joined the military on August the 1st of 1965, United States Air Force.
What was your rank and unit and specialty?
In Korea?
Yes, I'm sorry. Your rank while you were in Korea?
In Korea, I was a sergeant, munitions a specialist, weapons technician, and I was assigned to one of several units in the 2 years I was in Korea. Initially to Detachment 1, 63 14th Munitions Maintenance Squadron, 61 75th Air Base Group, 314th Air Division. That changed to 354th Tactical Fighter Wing while I was there, and I was also, for a period of time, assigned to the 61 75th Munitions Maintenance Squadron.
Okay. So what were you doing while you were in Korea?
I stored and maintained weapons systems.
Okay. And can you tell me about your military history? How you got what you did before Korea and all that?
Okay, I served in a surface-to-air missile interceptor squadron in Virginia at Langley Air Force Base, a Beaumark CIM-10B, which protected the East Coast, particularly the Washington and Norfolk metropolitan areas. Then I was assigned to Korea for 1 year. I extended for an additional year and served 2 years from April the 1st of 1968 through March the 31st of 1970. After that, I returned to Langley Air Force Base to the same missile interceptor squadron that I was at, served an additional 2 years, and served a total of 7 years of active military service. After leaving active military service, I worked as a police officer for several months in Virginia, returned to Texas to complete my education, and worked in the private sector for 5 years. During that time, immediately after leaving Virginia, I joined the United States Air Force Reserve at Carswell Air Force Base and served with the 301st TAC Fighter Wing as a ready reservist for the next 13 years and retired as a Master Sergeant.
So your only time overseas was in Korea?
Yes, all of my time overseas was in Korea.
And so that was, you said 1970, what year?
April of 1968 through March of 1970.
Okay. And what did where were you stationed when you were there in Korea?
At Kunsan Air Force Base, which is, as I recall, somewhere about 150 miles southwest of Seoul on the Yellow Sea.
Okay. Did you ever go to the DMZ during that time?
I did not. I made a number of trips to Seoul, riding on the trains, but and the farthest I got in Korea was at Chuncheon, which is, if I remember correctly, somewhere to the north of Seoul, between Seoul and the DMZ. Camp Page at that time was at Chuncheon. Now it's a ROK Army post, as I understand it.
Okay. And what was Korea like when you were there?
Hot, rainy, and muggy in the summertime, and very, very cold in the wintertime. The base that I was assigned to was originally set up for 900 airmen, and when I got there were 5,000. And the 5,000 airmen were all part of units that were either coming or going that had been assigned to Korea after the USS Pueblo was seized in January of 1968. So they moved a full tactical fighter wing into Korea. Before I arrived in April, that wing that I understand was diverted from Vietnam in response to the Pueblo crisis.
Oh, wow.
And it changed over to the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing in June, approximately 2 months after I arrived. So there was a lot of aircraft coming and a lot of aircraft going on a daily basis.
So you were there at a pretty stressful time, I'd say.
Yes.
Yeah. What was that like, being there with all the tension so high?
Well, the tension was high when certain provocative actions were taken in the north, in particular incursions into South Korea. We would change our munitions orders that were delivered to the flight line. Sometimes, on one occasion, we changed our mission 3 times in 24 hours, trying to anticipate what would happen.
So it's a busy time.
Well, this is where we were changing from perhaps an air-to-air mission to a anti-personnel division mission, or a heavy bomb mission, just depending on what we might possibly have to respond to.
Did you ever have to respond to anything?
No, thankfully.
Yes.
Thankfully.
What was Seoul like when you went to go visit it? Was it built up again, or no, not quite yet?
Interesting that you ask. I got a chance to see a lot of the Korean countryside in the various train trips that I made to Seoul, and outside of the Seoul metropolitan area and perhaps some of the other larger cities in Seoul where not necessarily a significant amount of rebuilding had taken place. They were only partially rebuilt, but nearly all of the streets were paved. When you leave the metropolitan area of Seoul, most of the streets and roads, with some exception, were not fully paved, and the living conditions were only marginally improved from the post-war days. The country was still in a transition from a recovery transition, and only partway through. One of the things I did observe was that they were handling their freedom in a remarkable way. A great deal of optimism, even though times were difficult and their days were long and hard. They got up, went to work every morning with a smile on their face, and which was amazing to see. Even if they had nothing, they would wear their very best when they went to work, change into work clothes, and then change back into their very best when they went home. And I had no understanding of that until reflecting back on the history of Korea and the colonial rule, harsh colonial rule under Japan from the early about 1900 to the end of World War II, 1945, in which they had been forced to convert to Japanese. All of their education and even many of their names were forcibly changed, and very, very harsh rule. They stripped the country of virtually all of their valuable raw materials, trees, and were particularly cruel.
So what made you reflect back on your experience in Korea?
One, I met my wife in Korea, and we've been married for nearly 50 years. She was a refugee during the war. She was about 8 years old when the war started. And I really didn't think a lot about it until I went back to school and took a graduate course on East Asian history, and reflected on my wife's experiences, and much of what I learned explained her attitudes, and really much of the values and attitudes of the Korean people today. And during the 1988 Olympics, I got a glimpse of the changes that had taken place, but only through a dim light. We went back in 2005, and the transformation was so remarkable, and I recognized that the time that I was there, the country was still deciding whether or not it would return to an autocratic form of government, which existed in Korea long before the Japanese came, or they would choose to be a constitutional democracy. And fortunately, during the 1970s and 1980s, after I left, it appeared that transformation accelerated, and particularly after the assassination of Park Chung-hee, the president, in I believe 1970, 71, somewhere in that time frame. And now his daughter is the president of Korea.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very amazing that she is a female in charge over there.
You're exactly right, and want to say this anyway, Asian societies have a tendency to be autocratic in terms of the rule of the king or whoever the strong man or straw man is that is in charge. And for this to occur in Korea, I mean, it's just amazing. And I don't think it would have occurred had we not maintained military forces in Korea from anywhere from 20 to 100,000 in the 60 years since the ceasefire.
While you were stationed in Korea, did you deal with any of the Korean troops?
Just tangentially.
Okay.
We would encounter them when they boarded buses to check IDs with their American military police counterparts, and occasionally we would encounter them on base, and relations were cordial. They were happy to be there because they had better food, I think, than when they were assigned to their units. And we did have Katusha forces on Kunsan Air Base that were assigned to an Army Hawk anti-aircraft battery. And also there were close-in anti-aircraft placements on the base, 40 millimeter guns and quad 50 half tracks.
What was your experience? Obvious, it must have been good with the Korean people while you were over there, since you met your wife.
Yeah. With the experience with the Korean people,
Yeah,
there was no place I could
civilians.
go that there was not even the most elderly Koreans that were anxious to help. I remember being in a large bus depot in Seoul, waiting on a bus transportation to travel to Chuncheon, civilian bus, and there must have been 25 or 30,000 people there. It was some sort of holiday, and the terminal manager apparently spotted me. I was taller than anyone else out in the middle of this sea of Koreans. Sent a young girl out there. She couldn't have been more than 16 or 17 years old, to bring me to the ticket area to find out where I was going, so that they made sure I got on the right bus. They would try to help carry, if I was carrying heavy luggage, to help me get the luggage to where I was going. It was just remarkable, the care and affection, even though they did not speak my language and I did not speak theirs. That they were happy we were there.
How did you meet your wife?
She worked at the base, and we became acquainted, and I was pretty young, barely 21 years old, and love at first sight.
That's wonderful.
And she spoke enough English that we understood each other, and it worked out. We have two adult daughters that I'm extremely proud of. So.
How many times have you been back to Korea?
Just the once in 2005,
Okay.
and we wanted to go back sooner, but the pace of life and the activities that we're involved in have prevented it. But every veteran that has ever served in Korea, whether during the war or after the war, needs to go back, particularly if they've not been back. If the last time they were there was earlier than 2001 or 2002, they would be amazed at what they did to make that possible.
It's an incredible transformation.
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
No question.
So how do you feel about the economic transformation that they've made?
Well, to go from virtually no economic reputation in the world to the among the 10 largest economies in the world is just unbelievable. I'm not sure any other country's done it that quickly, coming from as far down and destroyed or damaged as they were. And what makes it even more remarkable is the degree of subjugation that they were under, and the lack of education and promotion opportunities under the Japanese colonial rule. They lost 2 generations of future leaders being trained and equipped and educated to be the leaders of a new country, or the beginnings of a new country. The new beginnings for an old country is probably a better way to phrase it. Mm-hmm. And so, just unbelievable.
Can you tell me more about your thoughts on the U.S. staying in Korea? having troops stay there, and how you think it's affected the transformation?
It's allowed Korea to devote its attention not only to the economic affairs in their country, but to the larger geopolitical issues that exist in not only East Asia but South Asia. It's impacted relations with China and softened China's support of North Korea, which is an extreme version of Marxism, communist theocracy or theology, and allowed China to become more pragmatic in how they viewed their relationships with the rest of the world. Secondly, it's absolutely essential because as emphasis moves from the South Asia and East Asia or in the Middle East to East Asia, it's even more important that we maintain a strong presence there. It was the lack of American resolve in January of 1950 that ultimately led to Russian and Chinese support of Kim Il Sung in the attack on South Korea. The Secretary of State declared openly that Korea was not in the strategic interests of the United States, was outside that sphere of concern, and that was all it took, the tipping point. And it's essential to us since a huge portion of the world's population lives in China, Japan, Korea, and South Asia.
Do you support the reunification of Korea?
Only under a constitutional democracy. If that's not on the table, then that would hasten the return to the old ways.
I was just reading Robert Kaplan's The Revenge of Geography, and he was saying that the DMZ is an artificial boundary,
Yes.
and it's never going to stand. We're going to look back on it in 25 years and say, or
Sure.
however many years,
Sure.
and say it couldn't exist because it's an artificial boundary and not a natural one.
Well, it's much like the problem we have in the Middle East.
Yes.
Those are artificial boundaries that were established by Britain, and with the acquiescence of the other Allied forces well, both after World War I and after World War II. I mean, it's an old problem, and our boundaries that are put in place by the rule of military force never last. They always create the basis for the next war. Mm-hmm. So reunification has to take place at some point, but the cost of it in terms of bringing North Korea up to South Korean standards cannot be borne alone by the South Koreans. It will have to be Chinese, American, and anyone else that's interested in the long-term stability of East Asia.
That's very true. And you were in your early 20s while you were there?
I just turned 21.
Okay. How did that shape your experience? You said that you didn't get as involved while you were there as you would have liked to?
Well, we were too busy working. We were normally working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, which is, again, not combat, but it's still, you don't have much time for yourself. And the lack of cultural information before we left, or before we ever arrived in country. We had no idea. We just knew somewhat of the geography. It was a spot on the map to the west of Japan, and other than that, we didn't know. And now I have a much deeper appreciation of just the human struggle, and had I understood that more, I think it would have helped.
So you didn't know any Korean when you went?
No.
Wow.
No. I read Korean now and can sing in Korean. I learned to do that for church, and understand. I can order from a menu without the English, those sorts of things, but I still don't functionally speak Korean.
And your most difficult moments while you were there?
at least on one occasion when we were on alert after an incident on the DMZ, and it was so serious that they issued weapons to all the airmen on the base. And you know, and I said, and I had not been married for long, and my wife was, she lived off base, and I didn't know what was going to happen. We were working 12 and 18-hour shifts I'm not sure that I told her that if anything were to happen to destroy anything that linked her to me,